Our next speaker will be introduced by Julie Braungart-Rieker, the director for the Center of Children and Families that is sponsoring this conference and hosting. We're going to keep going here. If you need to take a bathroom break, then you'll just do it on your own, and there's still refreshments out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Darsha. I wanted to formally say thank you for putting this conference together. It's just truly amazing to see all the wonderful and interdisciplinary research all brought in together in one room. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Allan Schore. He comes here from the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at UCLA and the David Geffen School of Medicine. Dr. Schore integrates psychological and biological models of emotional and social development. He himself is a clinician and scientist and develops interpersonal neurobiological models of the impact of early attachment trauma on brain development. He studies a number of other very interesting and related areas. He looks at psychoanalytic conceptions of the early origins of the unconscious mind. He does neuroimaging research on the neurobiology of attachment, including studies of mothers with borderline personality disorder, and, which I wasn't aware of, does biological studies of relational trauma in wild elephants. Dr. Schore has received numerous awards, and I'll just tell you about one recent one. He was the recipient of APA's Division of Psychoanalysis Scientific Award in recognition of outstanding contributions to research, theory, and practice of neuroscience and psychoanalysis. He has many publications in scientific journals and edited volumes that not only span across disciplines, but span across the languages. He has several books, and he's probably very well known for his work on affect regulation and issues related to normative and psychopathological development. He's the editor and reviewer for a number of major journals and in both clinical and scientific disciplines. So without further ado, the title of Dr. Schore's talk today is Bowlby's Environment of Evolutionary Adaptiveness, Recent Studies on the Interpersonal Neurobiology of Attachment and Emotional Development.
So I want to reiterate what the other speakers have said. Darsha, thank you. This would not have happened, will not have happened without you. Deep appreciation for that. So what I want to talk about today is this problem of, the title of this conference is Bowlby's Environment of Evolutionary Adaptiveness. And I want to describe, to lead off here, what Bowlby had to say about this concept, and then also to trace it in terms of very recent neuroscience into the neurobiology of attachment and also into emotional development. So as you know, Darsha and Yak and I have written that American culture may be deviating increasingly from traditional social practices that emerged in our ancestral, quote, environment of evolutionary adaptedness. So here's John Bowlby, and incidentally, John Bowlby's major influences were Charles Darwin and Sigmund Freud. And in his classic book, in his first book, Attachment in 1969, here's how he framed it. He said, in the case of biological systems, structure takes a form that is determined by the kind of environment in which the system has been in fact operating during its evolution. This environment I propose to term the system's environment of adaptedness. Only within this environment of adaptedness can it be expected that a system will work efficiently. And in chapter 4, which was titled This Environment, he said, when we come to consider with what instinctive behavior, and now I'm relating back to Yak's talk about essentially instinctive behavior, or more properly, with what behavioral systems mediating instinctive behavior humans may be endowed, a first task to consider is the nature of the environment within which they are adapted to operate. The only relevant criterion by which to consider the natural adaptedness of any particular part of present-day man's behavioral equipment is the degree to which and the way in which it might contribute to population survival in man's primeval environment. And incidentally, in a recent conversation with Richard Bowlby, the son of John Bowlby, Richard told me that his father struggled with this concept, that he knew that there was money here, he knew that it was important. But at the time in 1969, as he was attempting to put together ethology, etc., with psychoanalysis, he struggled with this concept. So at the time he said, the concept of man's environment of evolutionary adaptedness outlined here is, of course, a version of man's ordinary expectable environment, not a single feature of a species' morphology, physiology, and behavior can be understood or even discussed intelligently, except in relation to that species' environment of evolutionary adaptedness. And then he directly goes in the next paragraph to the behavioral systems that tie the child to the mother. The behavioral systems responsible for maternal behavior in a species will work within certain ranges of social and physical environment and not outside them. In the next chapter, the child's tie to its mother, attachment behavior, where he now delivered the beginnings of the statement of attachment theory. He said, the child's tie to his mother is a product of a number of behavioral systems that have, and here's his term, proximity to the mother as a predictable outcome. Attachment behavior is regarded as what occurs when certain behavioral systems are activated. The behavioral systems themselves are believed to develop within the infant as a result of his interaction with his environment of evolutionary adaptedness, and especially of his interaction relationship with the principal figure in that environment, namely the mother. So I want to suggest, as Bowlby has spoken about in the cases of biological systems, structure takes a form determined by the kind of environment which the system has been in fact operating during its evolution, that in modern terms, biological structure relates directly to the morphology and the physiology of the developing brain that is evolving in a state of evolution during the period of attachment, during infancy. Now, I'm going to make the argument that the EEA is in actuality the social, emotional, relational environment provided by the primary caregiver, which shapes, for better or worse, the experience-dependent maturation of the brain systems evolved in attachment, these instinctual systems. This environment, I also want to suggest, does not operate at a verbal, conscious, linguistic level. It operates at nonverbal, implicit levels. Now, Bowlby gives some clues as to specifically which developing brain systems are influenced by the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. He says it's those involved in attachment systems mediating instinctive behavior that contribute again to population survival in man's primeval environment. Now, my work in interpersonal neurobiology and regulation theory indicates that attachment specifically shapes the connectivity of the early developing right brain, which is dominant for the control of vital functions supporting survival. And I'll speak quite a bit about this. I want to suggest also that current neuroscience is now describing in some detail the primacy of these early developing right brain structure function relationships over the pre and postnatal stages of life. And what I want to do now is to give a quick glimpse of these very recent studies about the right brain in the first year. So here's a name who has been mentioned already, Paul MacLean, the triune brain. In 1996, quote, for the mother, the experience during pregnancy of the formless life within could become after birth a sense of exteriorization and extension of the self that physiologically derives to a large extent from the right hemisphere. And here's in 1996, Colwyn Trevarthen. The right hemisphere is more advanced than the left in surface features from about the 25th gestational week, and this advance persists until the left hemisphere shows a postnatal growth spurt starting in the second year. The right brain being dominant for this entire first year, but now even in prenatal situations. And following up Cohen's ideas, look at these recent studies. There's one by Schleusner, Early Development, 2004, report, quote, an earlier maturation of certain right than homologous left hemispheric brain areas during fetal brain development. In other words, the EEA is acting on the fetus through the relationship with the mother. A few months ago, Kasparian, the prenatal origin, in an article entitled The Prenatal Origin of Hemispheric Asymmetry and In Utero Neuroimaging Study. Here they show that at 26 gestational weeks, fetuses show right superior temporal sulcus appearing earlier and deeper than the left, and they conclude our structural data further support the findings of functional neuroimaging studies indicating an earlier maturity of right hemispheric function. So here we are prenatal into the postnatal at birth. And in the journal Infancy, Walker, Andrews, and Barrick give as good a definition, quote, from birth, an infant is plunged into a world of other human beings in which conversation, gestures, and faces are omnipresent during the infant's waking hours. Moreover, these harbingers of social information are dynamic. They're continuously changing in time. They're multimodal. They involve different sensory affective systems, and they are reciprocal, which brings us to the current relational model of human development. So from the beginning, this baby is communicating with the social environment. And here you see in 1975, Brown and Jaffe, the right hemisphere can be considered dominant in human infancy for the type of visual and acoustic communication which is relevant for the prelinguistic child. Now, in the same book in '69, Bowlby was rather specific about the nature of attachment communications. He said, quote, they're accompanied by the strongest of feelings and emotion, that they are essentially affective communications. And I think we need to keep this in mind, especially in terms of the recent cognitive revolution, which I believe is now morphing more into an affective state. But he says more specifically, these communications occur within a context of facial expression, posture, tone of voice, physiological changes, tempo of movement, and incipient action. And in 1994, in Affect Regulation of the Origin of the Self, I suggested that during mutual gaze episodes of visual facial, tactile gestural, auditory prosodic, affective communications, the same ones that Bowlby was describing, the psychobiologically attuned caregiver not only communicates affective states, but regulates the infant's internal states of arousal. On this matter, Winnicott in '86 pointed out the main thing is a communication between the baby and the mother, not in terms of minds and cognitions, but in terms of the anatomy and physiology of live bodies, which is why, for me, the best iconic representation of the attachment, moving away from this mind-to-mind model, is this model, where they are both co-regulating their internal homeostatic states, their physiological states, their autonomic nervous systems, etc. We keep forgetting here that these are essentially psychobiological regulations. Two-way. 2001, out of Braun's lab in Germany, the dyadic interaction between the mother and the newborn and the mother constantly controls and modulates the newborn's exposure to environmental stimuli and thereby serves as a regulator of the developing individual's internal homeostasis. The regulatory function of the newborn-mother interaction may be essential promoter of more than their current psychobiological states, but a promoter to ensure the normal development and maintenance of synaptic connections during the establishment of functional brain circuits. For example, the brain circuits that Jaak was speaking about. So here, this is Colwyn's chart here of intersubjectivity, these communications back and forth between voice, face expressions, and hand gestures between the two. But now I want to look on the left side of this baby's brain and the impact of these communications on this baby's brain. Because there is massive synaptogenesis is occurring in the brain growth spurt that spans specifically the last trimester of pregnancy through the second year. So here's two recent studies in Matsuzawa and cerebral cortex. An MRI study shows the volume of the brain increases rapidly during the first 2 years. The normal adult appearance is seen at 2 years, and all major fiber tracts at age 3. Yes, certain parts of the brain will not evolve to maturation to later points, but all of the tracts are online, and infants under 2 years show higher right than left hemispheric volumes. In a more recent study, Nickmeyer, Journal of Neuroscience, total brain volume increased 101% in the first year, with a 15%, as you see it dropping down in the second. But I think even more important than that is the volume of the subcortical areas, including the brainstem, increased by 130% in the first year, 14% in the second year. That the attachment relationship is not just impacting the highest structures of the brain, but the subcortical areas, and I think more and more we are now moving in neuroscience into the importance of these subcortical areas, which are being impacted by the attachment relationship in an experience-dependent maturation in the second year. In 1996, I suggested, and this is the principle of intersubjectivity in neuroscience, of interpersonal neurobiology, the self-organization of the developing brain occurs in the context of another self, another brain. And I went on to also speculate, pulling forth the ideas in the 94 book, that the infant's early maturing right hemisphere, which is dominant for the child's processing of visual emotional information and dominant for the infant's recognition of the mother's face and the perception of arousal-inducing maternal facial expressions, whether they be joyous or fearful, is psychobiologically attuned to the output of the mother's right hemisphere, which is involved in the expression and processing of emotional information and in nonverbal communication. Now, in 1996, most of the studies were on animals, but of course, it's late in the 90s when the decade of the brain evolved, and we started to use neuroimaging. And so I just want to follow up very quickly some of these ideas. First of all, the right brain and visual facial attachment communications. You see in 2002, Turio Mazwaye, a PET study showing a study of a 2-month-old infant looking at an image of a woman's face, showing clearly activation of the infant's right hemisphere. Grossman in 2007, studying 4-month-old infants, presented with images of a female face gazing directly ahead of them, show enhanced gamma electrical activity, again over the right prefrontal areas, the right anterior cingulate. And in 2009, Nakato, using near-infrared spectroscopy, which is probably the best tool that we're now using in infant brain research, reveals that 5-month-old infant's right hemisphere again responds to images of adult female faces. So again, there is something about the face of the mother that is essential. And again, these ideas, these right posterior areas are in a critical period of maturation with massive synaptogenesis using this input to wire. And then Bowlby said auditory prosodic attachment communications. The tone, the emotional tone of the voice, the music of the voice, motherese. You see 2010, Mento, out 2 months ago, EEG study of auditory pitch processing in preterm infants born at 30 gestational weeks. Quote, these findings suggest that the earlier right structural maturation in fetal epochs seems to be paralleled by a right functional development. And these are the subcortical areas that are processing the tone of the voice. Because as Jacques points out, The auditory areas are not even myelinated at this point. 2009, Telgemeier, near-infrared spectroscopy of 2 to 6 day neonates. So these are now born, and we're now looking at neonates, show responses to slow acoustic modulations lateralized in the right hemisphere. I want to point out that Broca's and Wernicke's are not going to come into a critical period until the second year, the linguistic semantic. But look at these voice processing on the right. Here you see Homai 2006, prosodic processing in 3-month-old infants is observed by the right temporoparietal region. And here what they're studying is while the infant, this 3-month-old infant, is asleep and the mother is singing a lullaby, you see the right hemisphere being activated, sending this information right into the limbic system. Last month, Grossman, the developmental origins of voice processing in the human brain. So we're now not looking at linguistic processing, but voice processing. Another NIRS study of emotional prosody, 7-month-old infants. I'm moving this along in time to show the longitudinal effect here of this right moving to more complexity. Respond to emotional voices in a voice-sensitive region of, again, the right superior temporal sulcus. When the baby hears happy prosody, and there's more and more interest now in positive emotions, as Jacques was talking about, this also activates the right inferior frontal cortex. So this baby in a play situation with these playful voices, this is wiring up the right inferior frontal cortex. And they conclude, the pattern of findings suggests that temporal regions specialize in processing voices very early in development, and that already in infancy, emotions differentially modulate voice processing in the right hemisphere. And then the last I suggested that Bowlby talked about was tactile gestural attachment communication. This is the touch. So here you see Naji, I believe a student of Colwyn's, study of human neonates in their first 3 to 96 hours of life, and they find a lateralized system for neonatal imitation. She says, quote, the early advantage of the right hemisphere in the first few months of life may affect the lateralized appearance of the first imitative gestures. Soratsky and Wohl, 2005, on touch, Harlow-type touch, the emotional impact of touch, the most basic and reciprocal mode of interaction, is also more direct and immediate if an infant is held on the left side of the body. There are now 10 studies on left-sided cradling, right to right. And just this last month, coming out of Edtronic's lab, observe a left-sided regulatory gestures when infants are stressed. Infants cope with the emotional distress caused by unresponsive mothers, and we heard a little bit about this in the last talk, through self-regulation, through autoregulation, associated with a greater activation of the right hemisphere. So here you have the self-touching, etc., and you notice that the self-touching is all lateralized on the left side of the body, the right brain. In some, this finding supports the view that during a stressful condition, there is a state-dependent activation of the right hemisphere. Quote, more generally, these findings suggest that the right hemisphere is more involved in the social and biological functions regarding infant caregiver emotional bonding. So I've suggested in 1994 that attachment specifically impacts this early developing right brain. In Lancet in 1996, Soratsky and Wohl, the role of the right hemisphere is crucial in relation to the most precious needs of mothers and infants. And in 97, Sharon, in the journal Brain, an article, The Right Brain Hemisphere is Dominant in Human Infants. Indeed, the evidence is the right brain is dominant until the 3rd year of life, when the left begins its dominance. Here you see Braun, the right and the left human brain hemispheres differ in macrostructure, ultrastructure, physiology, chemistry, and control the behavior. We're now thinking these are not two different parts of one brain, the left and the right, but 2 separate processes. And again, Howard and Regia, earlier maturation of the right hemisphere is supported by both anatomical imaging evidence. So in the last 2 years, 3 studies, these just are examples, have now come out using more complex imaging data of mothers and infants. Here, Lenzi et al., these are mirror neuron researchers, an fMRI study of mother-infant emotional communication, and they offer data supporting the theory that the right hemisphere is more involved than the left hemisphere in emotional processing and thus mothering. So the biologically based, the psychobiological right hemisphere more than the left. In fact, they even imply that if the mother is raising the child with the left brain, this could lead to problems. Insecure avoidance. Noriyuchi, biological psychiatry, shows activation of the mother's right orbital frontal cortex during moments of maternal love triggered by viewing video of her own infant. And I like the fact that biological psychiatry, that hard science journal, is now using the term maternal love. And recently, Minagawa Kawai, in another study, a study in which the mother is looking at a video of its own baby laughing, showing her right orbital frontal being activated, which is directly correlated with her own subjective feeling of intense joy, and then showing the 12-month-old infant a video of her laughing mother and showing the right orbital frontal being activated. They come to the conclusion our results are in agreement with that of Schore, who addressed the importance of the right hemisphere in the attachment system, and that made my day. So I want to suggest that these bodily-based attachment transactions are imprinting the right brain, which is deeply connected into the emotion processing limbic system and also the autonomic nervous system. We heard a little bit about the limbic system. We'll hear more about the autonomic nervous system with Steve Porges. So here you see the functional maturation of limbic circuits is not just genetically encoded. It's significantly influenced by early socio-emotional experience. Here's Depreto. Typically developing children can rely upon a right hemisphere mirroring neural mechanism interfacing with the limbic system via the insula, whereby the meaning or imitated or observed emotion is directly felt and hence understood. And again, the left hemisphere is not even in a state of maturation here. So we'll hear more about this, but here's Steve Porges, consistent with the views that the right hemisphere appears to play a greater role in affect, especially the adaptive expression of negative affect. Remember, the negative affect is just as adaptive as positive affect. The right hemisphere also appears to have a greater role in regulation of cardiac function, presumably via shifts in vagal regulation. McGilchrist, the right hemisphere is more closely in touch with emotion in the body, therefore with the neurologically, quote, inferior and more ancient regions of the central nervous system. And here's Yock, cognitive science must relearn that ancient emotional systems have a power that is quite independent of neocortical cognitive processes. So I want to suggest it's this right vertical axis which is being set up by these pre- and postnatal situations. Information from the brainstem, from the body, from the autonomic nervous system, the arousal system. Notice the pain systems also, up the limbic system, and then into the high right hemisphere, etc., and then crossing callosally, and then incidentally coming back to the high right. A few more pieces here. Here's Megan Gunner showing that maternal care within the attachment relationship shapes the infant's hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is going to be key to the ability to regulate stress at all later points of the lifespan. Whittling in Germany showing that the right hemisphere regulates the HPA axis and indeed mediates the human stress response. This is not done by the conscious linguistic left hemisphere, that the right hemisphere is central to the control of vital function, supporting survival and enabling the organism to cope with stress and challenges, including relational stress, interpersonal stress. And the work of Sullivan here, 4 studies now showing that optimal stress regulation is dependent on right hemispheric specialization regulating stress and emotion-related processes. We should remember that the highest centers of stress regulation in the brain are not in the verbal left hemisphere, they're in the right hemisphere. And this has a lot of meaning for another area of my work, psychotherapy and psychotherapeutic change. How do we get to the right? So subsequent to the child's formation of an attachment to the mother in the first, child forms another to the father in the second. You see the biorhythmicity of man with infant and women with infant affords the infant to have interactive, state-sharing, and state-attuning experiences with two different kinds of caregivers. We know that the mother is more involved with soothing and calming, the father more involved in more high arousal functions. I've suggested also that as the mother in the first year is necessary to for the toddler's ability to regulate fear, the father, especially in the second year, is important for aggression regulation. So the right hemisphere ends its initial growth spurt in the middle of the end of the second year as the left hemisphere begins it. But the right will go back into growth spurts, right, left, throughout later points in the lifespan. There is plasticity in the system, which is why psychotherapy has its possibility. But these are later or less intensive growth spurts. But I want to point out here that the adaptive functions of the right brain, which are set up by the attachment relationship, are critical for functioning social emotional functions over the entire lifespan. My work, in essence, suggests that attachment shapes the experience-dependent maturation and thereby the lateralization of this emotional right brain. The attachment mechanism is expressed later in implicit, nonverbal affect communication. Yes, the left in explicit, declarative memory, etc., but the right in implicit, nonverbal affect communication and implicit, non-conscious, interactive stress regulation. So here you see Brancucci in a recent article, an overview article, the neural substrates of the perceptions of voices, faces, gestures, smells, pheromones, as evidenced by modern neuroimaging techniques, are characterized by a general right hemispheric functional asymmetry. Furthermore, this right brain, for the rest of the lifespan, shoots. The right hemisphere operates a distributed network for rapid responding to danger and other urgent problems. It preferentially processes environmental challenge, stress, and pain, and manages self-protective responses such as avoidance and escape. Incidentally, when they go awry, here's where psychopathology is exactly in these functions. And one more, Uden, the emerging picture from the current literature seems to suggest a special role of the right hemisphere in self-related cognition, own body perception, self-awareness, and autobiographical memory. Incidentally, all of those are part of psychotherapy also. So these adaptive right brain functions are initially imprinted in right brain to right brain affective bodily-based communications during critical periods of infancy. This is Vadim Rotenberg, Israeli psychiatrist. The main functions of the right hemisphere: the ability to grasp the reality as a whole, the emotional attachment to the mother, the regulation of withdrawal behavior in the appropriate conditions, the integration of affect, behavior, and autonomic activity are the basic functions of survival, and for this reason are the first to appear. I want to suggest the capacities which make us most human. Empathy, there's a large literature to show that empathy is also right brain. But these adaptive functions of an efficient lateralized right brain only evolve in an optimal early relational environment of evolutionary adaptedness. However, if the primary caregiver chronically dysregulates the child's arousal and doesn't repair the states of attachment ruptures and these negative affective states that ensue, this inhibits right brain maturation. I won't go into this. Massive cortisol release, etc., high levels of glutamate, you're aware of these. But what I'm suggesting here is that severe alterations of the EEA lead to enduring inefficient capacities for coping with interpersonal stressors and a predisposition to later psychiatric disorders. And the left hemisphere may not necessarily be problematic. You might have 130 IQ, etc. But essentially, this predisposition for psychiatric disorders, which are marked by affect dysregulation, etc. A large number of studies now demonstrate that brain alterations are associated with less than optimal early maternal care, including one by Achisi out of Sumi's laboratory, also showing, incidentally, a right lateralization of serotonergic problems. So here you see, in a very recent study, only 4 studies have been done on the effect of the father on the baby's brain. And all of them are done in Germany. Talk about another hot topic, that this country, etc. Showing that a lack of paternal care in infancy significantly associated with delayed and partly suppressed development of orbitofrontal circuits, including a problem of orbitofrontal amygdala connections, which of course would be severe stress regulation problems. These pre- and postnatal affective transactions also impact, and Darsha noted this, the maturation of systems involved in immunocompetence in the developing brain, because the connections between the immune system and the nervous system are also made in this first early period. And thereby, these transactions, if they are highly dysregulated, will lead to a risk for not only later forming psychiatric disorders, but medical disorders. So I just pulled out 3 titles here. Early childhood stress is associated with elevated antibody levels to herpes simplex virus 1. Childhood maltreatment predicts adult inflammation in a life course study. Childhood maltreatment as a risk factor for adult cardiovascular disease and depression. Actually, this last one is now moving ahead really nicely, this field of depression and cardiovascular. So what I'm suggesting here is that extreme deviations in the EEA, again, their shape and form is problematic. Recently, I've written a synopsis in a book edited by Ruth Lanius, now out by Cambridge about 2 months ago. The title of the book is The Impact of Early Life Trauma on Health and Disease. Look at the subtitle, The Hidden Epidemic. Now, this book is mostly written by psychiatrists and trauma researchers. And I suggested in this synopsis of about 6 or 7 different studies, recent models of early life trauma are altering their focus from deficits in later maturing conscious, verbal, explicit, and voluntary behavior, language, to impairments of early maturing non-conscious, non-verbal, implicit, and automatic adaptive social emotional functions. Developmental neuroscience is now moving from studies of the later maturing left brain, conscious verbal cognitive processes, into the early preverbal development of adaptive emotion processing right brain systems in pre- and postnatal periods. So along those lines, I want to suggest here that attachment shapes the experience-dependent maturation and also the evolving lateralization of the right brain. The early right brain lateralization, I want to suggest, is an interpersonal neurobiological measure of the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. In operational terms, it's right brain maturation and the lateralization of these functions, touch, prosody, facial expression, is an indicator of the development of the right brain, the social brain. And severe alterations of the EEA will alter the developmental trajectory of this right brain. Here you see Simeon Tove, 2008. Functional hemispheric lateralization is considered crucial for brain efficiency. It enhances neural capacity by allowing separate, parallel, and specialized processings in the hemispheres. A central role was ascribed to the right hemisphere in perception and processing of emotions. Mento, earlier this year, the right hemisphere would sustain the functions necessary for the survival of the species. I'm going back to the EEA original with survival, such as visual, spatial, the ability to read facial expressions, or emotional processes. Consequently, the earlier and faster development of the neural substrates underlying these functions is needed to prevent possible impairment during infancy and childhood. Early alterations of the normal hemispheric asymmetry in terms of functional development in extremely immature infants, which are high risk, has recently been related to several neurocognitive developmental impairments during childhood and adulthood. More than just autism, incidentally, here. 2005, in the journal Laterality, Schutz and Reed, although the infant brain was historically reported to be undifferentiated in terms of cerebral lateralization until 2 years of age, because when you were looking only at language functions, it didn't come out, so they weren't looking earlier. Evidence has accumulated indicating that lateralized functions are present much earlier in development. So I want to suggest that in the first 2 years, the evolving right lateralized visual facial, auditory prosodic, and tactile gestural functions of the human social brain can be assessed over the pre- and postnatal stages of infancy to appraise the ongoing status of emotional and social development. Ullman has suggested that the strong and consistent predominance for the right hemisphere emerges postnatally, so that the posterior parts of the right lateralize first and then the anterior. Here you see Grossman in postnatal periods. Responses to voices and emotional prosody might thus serve as one of potentially multiple markers that can help with an early identification of infants at risk for neurodevelopmental disorders. In other words, infants who are not responding to the tone, to the emotional tone, to the mother's voice, and as they should become even more and more complex over the right. And then, of course, there are many studies now pointing to the importance of looking at early face processing as being also a marker of altered development. And here, Monte Rosso out of Tronick's laboratory, they're now calling for the studies of different gestures with simultaneous measurement of brain functions. Such studies would also be useful with samples of high-risk infants whose behavior and brain organization may be compromised. In other words, I'm suggesting instead of looking at the early precursors of language development, we look at these functions, these right brain functions from pre- and postnatal. Here's one more. Environmental factors contribute to the development of hemispheric asymmetry. Attachment shapes this lateralization on the right, as shown here on the cellular and network dendrites levels. In fact, they show that stress impacts dendrites in the frontal areas of specifically the right medial cortex and not the left. In general, hemispheric lateralization appears to be characterized for the adequate function of sensory cortices and also for the prefrontal and limbic regions. And this is what we need. We need assessment of these prefrontal regions, especially the orbital frontal, the anterior cingulate, down the line to the amygdala, the right insula, etc., into the hypothalamus, moving down this neuroaxis. The evolution of right lateralized nonverbal emotional communication and affect regulation could be used diagnostically as markers of attachment development, complexity of right brain maturation, infant mental health, and targets of early relational intervention. In 2001, I edited an issue of the Infant Mental Health Journal, Contributions from the Decade of the Brain to Infant Mental Health, and actually both Jaak and Cohen were part of that. And in that, I suggested adaptive infant mental health can be fundamentally defined as the earliest expression of efficient and resilient strategies for coping with novelty and stress, and maladaptive infant mental health as a deficit in these same coping mechanisms. The former is a resilience factor for coping with psychobiological stressors at later stages of the life cycle. The latter is a risk factor for interruptions of the developmental processes and a vulnerability to the coping deficits that define later forming psychopathologies. So in 1994, I suggested the child's, in fact, in the first paragraph of the Green Book, I said, the child's first relationship, the one with the mother, acts as a template as it permanently molds the individual's capacities to enter into all later emotional relationships. I want to suggest that assessments of infant mental health and social emotional development in the first year must evaluate not only the infant's right brains, but the right brains of both members of the attachment dyad. We must be evaluating relationships and relational capacities. And again, I'm suggesting, therefore, evaluate the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. Bowlby's concept of the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness represents the psychological space that a particular culture creates to optimize the emotional attachment bonding between mothers and infants. The evolutionary mechanism of attachment. Bowlby said that it's an evolutionary mechanism. This space can either be expansive or it can be constrictive. On the matter of attachment, we're now looking at it this way. If the attachment relationship is indeed a major organizer of brain development, as many have accepted and suggested, then the determinants of attachment relationships are important far beyond the provision of a fundamental sense of safety or security. They're the mechanism that allows postnatal brain development to move to more optimal positions. Brain development is directly impacted by the attachment transactions in the first 2 years in the development of the right, more so than in the later maturing left brain. I want to fundamentally, therefore, suggest that the EEA supports or inhibits the experience-dependent maturation of the right brain. And this conference is talking about the dangers of the latter. In the Infant Mental Health Journal, in the introduction, I suggested the earliest, in 2001, the earliest stages of humanhood are critical because they contain within them the representation of our possible futures. They model the potential developmental extension of our individual and collective social identities. The essential question is, therefore, when and where shall we place our current resources so as to optimize the future of human societies? How much should we value the very beginnings of human life in tangible social program dollars? I thank you for your attention.
We can take one or two questions. There are microphones. Oh, there's one standing up, and there's one over here. Please use the microphone.
That's a wonderful synopsis, Allan. Let me ask you one paradoxical question and how you feel about it. There is a kind of mountain of neuropsychological data ever since Guido Gainotti in Italy, indicating that in general in the human population, the right hemisphere is more negativistic, whereas the left blathering hemisphere is pretty happy. Why is that?
Yeah. Let me point out that the idea that the left hemisphere is dominant for positive emotions and the right hemisphere is dominant for negative emotions, which comes out of Davidson and E.G. work now, in my reading of the literature, is not supported. He backed off of that and he said an approach on the left and withdrawal on the right. That being the case, I just suggested one study here that when the mother is processing the positive aspect of the mother's voice, the right brain is dominant, etc. We are seeing more and more that pleasantness has something to do with left hemisphere, but high-intensity joy in human beings has to do with a high arousal, positive affect of the right hemisphere. And a large number of, although the EEG studies were showing that, a large number of the neuroimaging studies are now showing that a number of right brain functions are extremely high arousal, positive joy states also. The ability to process music, the empathy, etc. In fact, many studies of humor also showing lateralization on the right hemisphere. So we've got to overcome that old bias about the left rational brain being the good one and the right being, the source of negative affect.
I think let me just follow up on that. Certainly, Davidson's backing off from it, but all the data is correlative that supports it. The neuropsychological data that Gainotti and the neurologists have provided is causal, namely damage to the hemispheres, whether it's done by carotid infusion of barbiturates or stroke. That causal data suggests the opposite. That So.
Well, I was simply going to add, you see a lot more dysphoria in the right hemisphere strokes than you do in the left hemisphere strokes. I've talked to a couple of neurologists who said if they had their choice, they'd rather have their stroke in the left hemisphere because they wouldn't say anything, but they'd feel a lot better.
Right.
I mean, it's a lovely talk, and a lot of this right hemisphere stuff, to be honest, was news to me and fascinating. But I'd like to challenge a little bit. What I wonder if it's not the idealization of the EEA. My view is that there must have been EEAs. There wasn't a singular environment of evolutionary adaptation, and not all of those contexts were benign and loving and lovely. In fact, interestingly, even in Mary Ainsworth's original work in Uganda, Kevin McDonald has pointed out that she didn't see much play, and this goes back to the first talk, between mothers and babies. They were good at soothing, they were good at comforting, they held their babies a lot, but joy was not something they seemed to be spending much time provoking. If we consider the possibility that much of life on this planet was, not just fun and joy for humans early in time, but also precarious, risky, dangerous, etc., then it seems to me we have to entertain the possibility that there wasn't only a singular model of, quote, optimal development, but a diverse set. I'll say more about this tomorrow myself when I make some more comments, but I just want to throw out the possibility that in some ways we're talking in a kind of singular, idealized way about, almost a Garden of Eden kind of original context in which mothers exclusively loved their babies, babies developed and evolved exclusively to reciprocate that love.
Yeah. Well, let me suggest here that what I've suggested is that the literature is showing that the right brain is dominant for regulating stress. And the matter of stress being part of all human relationship, but the right is also dominant. And in the Davidson work, everyone has agreed that the right is dominant for negative emotions, etc. On that matter, I would suggest that the environment changes when it starts shaping up the left brain and what is necessary to move the left brain to complexity. Just as the mother is changing from an attachment object to a socialization agent in the second year. And that the mother is also changing over the first year. That she is initially responding and picking up subcortical mechanisms, but then as the right evolves over the year, she herself is now moving to more complexity and she is changing. So part of a secure attachment is a mother whose environment of evolutionary adaptability is shifting resiliently over time. And that flexibility turns out to be a key for mental health. But again here, I want to suggest here that the evidence is now strong that this right brain does come online even before the left. It begins to evolve in the second year, and that there has been an overemphasis, I would suggest, on the left hemisphere. There has been an overemphasis on linguistic, rational, logical, etc., and that the whole key, and Jaak and I agree in this, that the answers to human nature as to why humans kill other humans, as to why human beings can form loving bonds, has more to do with the bodily-based right brain, which essentially the left really still wants no part of. A book has just come out by McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary, in which he's suggesting that the right brain is the master, but the emissary, the left hemisphere, at times will betray the master. And that I want to suggest also that part of the problem that we're seeing right now in this and other culture is the overemphasis of left hemispheric, verbal, logical, analytical, sequential traits. Incidentally, a study has come out from Germany now showing that the left hemisphere is dominant for power dynamics. So here, this matter of those dynamics, it takes both brains literally to be able to function in the world. But again, what caregivers are doing in the first year of life and then what they need to shift to do at later points are important. What we have overlooked, I'm suggesting, is these early beginnings. And more we're seeing that these early beginnings really shape the trajectory of everything that is to come. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.